amendments. The first 10 became the Bill of Rights. The 12th one passed in 1993, 200 years later. It's the 27th Amendment. It's the one that says pay raises don't take effect until after you had a full congressional cycle, so Congress can't vote itself a raise. It's that one. This amendment, the one about the having 6,000 congressmen, that was the first one proposed. The first amendment proposed because the people who proposed the 12 articles of the first ranked them in order, and they considered this one to be the most important. It's still on the books. It's been passed by the House and the Senate. If the 27th Amendment can get passed 200 years later, this one can get passed 220 years later. This one can still get ratified. This can come into effect. You want to change the face of Congress, this bill will do it. You want congressmen you can have access to who will kick over the apple cart, make a fuss, and scream and holler and maneuver and do everything they can to represent you? This is a good way to do it, folks. It's already out there. The last one I really want to talk about is the committee system. We're all familiar with committees in Congress. Jeff Miller just got appointed the head of the Veterans Affairs Committee. The committee system is like many ideas. It's been used for a horrible purpose, and that is to basically create islands of power in the Senate and the House. And if you ever want to know why things don't change in Washington, the committee system as it stands today is the most egregious reason. The committee system was created at the beginning of Congress for the simple reason that we all form committees. It's just easier to split the work up. No congressman can know every single issue, so you specialize. You have some people on agriculture, defense, justice, whatever you deem fit. These folks can focus, can be the experts, can do the heavy lifting, and then make a recommendation to the whole body as, do we vote in favor of it or not? These are the folks who are, in theory, supposed to read the law before it is passed. That means that everyone's reading something, but not everyone has to read everything. In typical fashion, it's grown way beyond that. Because of something called a discharge petition, basically each congressional committee, in very simplified terms, can control the flow of legislation within its own little bailiwick. If you want to pass a bill that involves agriculture, say, we would like to end agriculture subsidies, would be a good example. That bill would have to be submitted to the Agriculture Committee or its appropriate subcommittee, which would look at it, investigate it, issue a report and a recommendation, and send it to the floor. What happens is it goes to committee, it gets passed around, it dies in committee because they don't release it or discharge it to the floor. And of course they make sure that anyone who wants to vote in favor of it, if they disagree with that bill, is dissuaded from making any waves. You can pass what's called a discharge petition and say we force this bill out of committee onto the floor for an up and down vote. To do that, you have to have a majority of signatures. Then the House has to vote on the discharge. Then you vote on the bill, and then it goes to the President. If it passes to the Senate, then up to the President to be signed off on. To put in perspective, between 1931 and 2003, 563 discharge petitions were filed. 47 received enough signatures. 26 actually got discharged. And only 2 became law. Kind of puts in perspective. Now, one of them was fortunately the Gun Owners Protection Act, which I personally appreciate, so it sometimes works in our favor. But here's the point. This means that committees are semi-autonomous, and committees self-select. Jeff Miller is on the Armed Services Committee for a very important reason. We've got about a dozen major military installations here. The military is very important to this area, and if we don't have a congressman on that committee, then during various events such as BRAC realignment and closure, budget cuts, or just the meanderings of other congressmen who'd like to take some pork, those bases can go away. It's a simple fact of life. The Agriculture Committee that I cited, Jeff Miller has absolutely no reason to get on the Agriculture Committee because you're only allowed 2 committee assignments on Capitol Hill. And you can only be the chairman or subcommittee chairman on one committee. So he's chosen veterans and armed services. Only two. And those two benefit our area. He could have chosen, say, armed services and foreign affairs, or armed services and budget. Or if he wanted to be really powerful, he would have bucked for a slot on the appropriations chair, which controls everything. But here's the point. If Jeff Miller says, I'm going to put together a bill to end farm subsidies, it's just a PR exercise, no matter how well-intentioned it is, because it will go to the Agriculture Committee and it'll die, because who's on the Agriculture Committee? Not guys like Jeff Miller or Steve King or any of the folks who actually would like to eliminate it. It's full of people, congressmen from Iowa and Nebraska and big farming states. And the reason they're on there is because they've got big agriculture interests. And as a result, they tend to be in favor of subsidies, because here's the effect. It makes it easier for special interests to insert what they need, because they only have to target a few congressmen. Agriculture interests could care less about Jeff Miller and how he votes, because Jeff Miller isn't going to affect farm subsidies or agriculture policy in any meaningful way. Jeff Miller, I don't even have to check, probably hasn't received a dime from agriculture interests. Nor would he ever. And he can rail about them all he wants. Because every special interest, every large agriculture corporation, every farmers organization, the American Dairy Farmers Association, the American Farmers Association, the American Cattlemen's Association, and I only know those names because my grandfather used to be president of the American Dairy Farmers Association. He was a dairy farmer. But those guys talk to their congressmen all the time, the way we would like to talk to our congressmen all the time. And a lot of those special interests will throw money around. And it's very cost effective, because they don't have to hit 435. They only need to hit 20 or 30 people on a committee. If they play their cards right, they only need to deal with maybe 4 or 5 committee chairmen. And all those staffers who work on Capitol Hill, the underpaid ones, of which I used to be, a lot of them will go work for the various lobbying organizations to represent it. So I can guarantee you, if you look at the committee chairman and look at the special interest, a lot of their former staffs are working for the American Cattle Association, the American Dairy Farmers Association, the Tobacco Institute. Just like the fact that I know that a number of Congressman Hutto's and a number of Congressman Miller's staffs have gone to work for firms that deal with the defense a lot. Lockheed Martin, the lobbying firms that represent the defense industry, veterans organizations. And sometimes they do good work and sometimes they do bad. Point here is the committee system really prevents reform. How many of you have been railing against farm subsidies for years? Thought it was a bad idea. Probably 10, 20 years. And a lot of people say, let's just end them. There's lots of good arguments for it, but it never gets advanced. And again, the committee system makes it very difficult. Because here's the dirty little secret. If a congressman, and I go back to my comment about Ron Paul, Democrats hate him, Republicans hate him. Ron Paul does that. And as a result, when he causes that much trouble, it makes it problematic for him to be in a position to influence legislation behind the scenes or on a committee. Ron Paul, love him or hate him, stands by his principles. And there's a cost. And so that's the problem. Changing the committee system, and obviously this would be a difficult one, but encouraging our congressmen to change the committee system so that they no longer have this power to prevent legislation from coming to the floor would be a huge step towards any kind of reform. It's going to be an uphill battle. Last time we had any success was 1931. They reduced the number of votes needed to go from a discharge from half of Congress to 1/3 of Congress. It lasted for 4 years before congressmen said enough of that nonsense. The committee system is one thing that must change if you want meaningful reform. Because without it, you're dealing with semi-autonomous bodies that have special interests behind them. So keep this in mind. Those are really the things I want to talk about, those 3 critical issues. There's other things you can look at that are useful that I'm not going to go into because, frankly, I'd like to keep this short. The Commerce Clause, obviously, there's things we can do to address that. That has been the stretched infinitely to give constitutional cover to everything. There's the campaign finance reforms that have really made it harder and harder to run. Those need to end. People need to be able to run very easily, simply, transparently. Making it harder through campaign finance reform, which is poorly named, has just made it harder and harder and made special interest money that much better. But really, those three foundational things, the committee system, the number of congressmen, the mysterious 28th Amendment, I'd like to call it, the 17th Amendment, those are issues. Those are the changes to our foundation that have made it possible for our federal government to grow into the monster it is today. If you're interested in reform, those foundational items are things that need to be looked at over the long term. As long as we keep doing that, we might win on Obamacare, we might win on gun control, we might win on any number of issues, but there will always be something new, because as long as these three items aren't addressed, the federal government will still be very distant, very powerful, and very intrusive. So with that, I'd like to thank you again for having me here. Hope you enjoyed it. If anyone has any questions, now would be the time.
The 24th Amendment, you said, was in 92. If I remember correctly, is that what you said?
Yes, 93 actually, yes.
93. I've heard a lot of people say we don't want any more amendments because once we open up for amendments, we lose our First and Second Amendment and all this. It didn't happen in 92. Do we have a risk of it happening if we try to change the Constitution again?
There's always a risk, but the founders made it very, very difficult. You have to go through the House, has to go through the Senate, and then 2/3 of the states have to ratify it. So it is possible, but that's a risk that's going to be inherent regardless. The thing about the 28th Amendment, this amendment, is it's already been passed. It's, the thing about amendments is they don't expire. Once they're passed by a state, that vote counts in perpetuity until either that state takes a separate action to repeal their vote prior to passing it, or the thing's passed in its entirety. That's why the amendment in 1993 could get passed, even though it had been sitting out there for 200 years. I mean, most folks don't even realize that the Bill of Rights was actually started out with 12. They just think it's the first 10. Those last two are footnotes in history as far as most people are concerned. But you're absolutely right. The amendment process, the risk for being abused is always there. It could repeal every fundamental right of liberty that's in the Bill of Rights if abused.
Pam Bondi, what would be holding her and the other 26 back from going to Judge Vincent now? Is there a time period they have to wait to give the government time to...
No. I mean, the government has already demonstrated that its intention.
Scuccinelli's already gone to the Supreme Court.
Yeah. Now, there are two reasons, and I don't know what Pam Bondi's motivations are. There would be one reason for doing it, which is it clears up the issue, it brings it to a head, and the judge says yes or no. That's a good reason for doing it, especially if you don't think it's going to be heard by an appellate of the Supreme Court. Now, when you make the motion for the injunction and tie it up, it's going to tie things up in court a little bit. So there is a chance that she might have been told informally that this is going to get fast-tracked at the appellate and Supreme Court level. Do not do anything to slow it down. It does not happen very often, but there are signals that the higher courts can send. That's why lawyers always say, listen carefully to what the judge says, because the judge might not be able to tell you something in politic or illegal, but they can kind of give you a good wink and a nudge. And if the judge has said, you really need to think long and hard about doing this because I believe the appellate court is going to hear this very soon, that, and I'm kind of saying it jokingly, that might have been the signal saying, look, we can't say it, but this is going to go very quickly. I don't know. There is a good reason for her not to seek it. Or there could be a lot of bad reasons. Personally, if it was up to me, I would be seeking it. But I'm not the guy on the seat, and I have to admit that there are some tactical reasons why you might not want to do it.